When we looked at the different power supply options, one of the characteristics we looked at was this idea of variability. We looked at whether different supply options could be dispatched on demand, or whether they were variable depending on the weather, for example, like wind and solar. Here I just want to very briefly look at variability not of supply but of demand for electricity. And I'll do that by showing a couple of examples from real data sets just to illustrate how much electricity demand can vary, on what kind of timescales, and by what kind of amounts. This chart is plotting power demand data for the UK for the whole of 2015. So the y-axis is power, megawatts, and the x-axis, if I were to draw one, is time, and it starts from the 1st of January on the left through to the 31st of December on the right. And so a few things are immediately obvious. We have a maximum power demand just under 55,000 megawatts over on the left of the chart, and then also we've got some higher demand over on the right. So on the left of the chart, that's the period kind of January, February, and on the right, November, December. So peak power demand in the UK is in the winter. Compare that to the summer months, June, July, August, where the maximum demand is never getting above maybe 37,000, 38,000 megawatts. So there's a big difference seasonally between winter and summer. In the winter in the UK, we have much higher electricity demand than we do in the summer. The same pattern is also visible for minimum demand. In the winter, that's between 25,000–30,000 megawatts. In the summer, it drops to just above 20,000 megawatts at the minimum times. So the variation in minimum demand is a little bit less than the variation in maximum demand, but again, still quite substantial. The other thing you can see is that the data looks quite jaggedy. You can pick out some broad dark areas with thinner light areas in between. And if you do that, you'll find that there are about 52 of them, because what we're seeing there is actually differences in demand in the week versus the weekend. And I can show you that if now, rather than looking at an entire year's data, we look at two example weeks, one in January in blue, so one in the winter, and one in the summer, one in June in red. And if you look at the January one in particular, you'll notice that for the first 5 days of that week, Monday to Friday, the demand is peaking up at around 50,000 megawatts, whereas at the weekend, the demand peak is much lower, around about 45,000 megawatts. So we have higher demand for electricity in the week, the working week in the UK, than we do at the weekend. You have a similar pattern in the summer, although again it's less pronounced difference between the two because everything is lower. And of course the other thing that this starts to show much more clearly is the range of demand over the course of a day. You can see on the Monday in January, demand peaked at about 50,000 megawatts. Later on that night, demand was down at 30,000 megawatts. So 20,000 megawatts of difference between peak and minimum demand over the course of just a single day. That's obviously a very substantial amount. So let's home in on a day. I've actually picked a more recent day here. It's from 7 AM on the 8th of February to 7 AM on the 9th of February, so a 24-hour period in 2016. Again, it's a winter day, and so we have a high maximum demand approaching 50,000 megawatts, and we have a much lower minimum demand down at between 25,000 and 30,000 megawatts. And a term you'll sometimes hear used to describe the minimum level of demand over a period is baseload. So we have peak power and baseload power with a very large difference between the two. You can also see, homing in on this 24-hour plot, how rapid some of the changes are. So in particular, if we look at 5 a.m. through till 7 or 8 a.m., there's a very, very rapid rise. There's a rise of almost 10,000 megawatts of extra demand in the period of about 2 hours. Equally, in the evening, demand drops from, in this case, around about 47, 48,000 megawatts, right the way down to 30,000 megawatts over a period of about 4 hours. So really quite rapid changes in demand for electricity over relatively short periods of time. And just to show you an example from the other side of the world, in yellow on this chart, I've plotted over that exact same day some data from New South Wales in Australia. The scale for that yellow Australian curve is the one on the right. So you can see that whereas the UK varies from about 30,000 megawatts up to about almost 50,000 megawatts, the New South Wales data is varying from about 6,000 megawatts up to about 10,000 megawatts. So in terms of scale, the UK is about 5 times bigger than the New South Wales data. But you can see broadly similar things. Obviously demand is lowest in the middle of the night. It rises quite rapidly during a morning period. And then you have a peak, in this case, from kind of mid-afternoon to early evening, a little bit earlier than the example in the UK. And then after that peak, demand drops down to the low levels in the middle of the night. In the case of the Australian data, that morning ramp up is of a similar rate, but some of the other gradients in terms of how quickly demand is changing over time are a bit shallower. But still a big difference between peak and baseload demand on that particular day. And one final thing that's evident from this chart is how choppy the data is. They're not nice, smooth curves, particularly the data from Australia. And we can home in on that to see it a bit more closely. In both cases, the data I'm using to plot these charts are based on 10-minute intervals. In other words, for each of those 10-minute intervals, the data is giving an average power demand, and then I'm plotting those average power demands to give the curves you can see, which aren't nice smooth curves, but which show also that demand is not just varying during the course of a day, or a week, or a year, but even on a minute-by-minute basis, there are relatively substantial changes in that data. So we know that electricity supply can vary because we can either choose when to generate or when not to generate by deciding whether to burn fuel in the power station, or in the case of wind and solar, the supply varies because the amount of wind or the amount of sunshine varies. But what's crucial to realise is that demand varies too, and it varies by large amounts on a variety of timescales, from very short timescales, minute by minute, through to very large changes on seasonal and annual timescales. So variability is not something that's new, it's just that you tend to hear about it more when people are referring to supply, and in particular the supply of renewable power. Even before renewables were about, variability has been something that grid systems, power systems have had to cope with. They've had to make sure that supply matches demand at every moment. That's why it's been so important to have dispatchable sources of power, so that as demand is allowed to vary, because we don't constrain when people can turn their televisions or their lights on, supply has to vary too in order to match it. What is new is that as well as demand varying by large amounts on various timescales, if we start adding certain renewables into the mix, particularly solar and wind, we have supply that's varying as well. And that really is the new challenge, is matching a variable supply with a variable demand. Okay, thank you.